policy, with a specific focus, of course, on both Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia-Turkey normalization. The second panel on domestic political will, of course, be related, because in many ways, in the Armenian reality, it's very difficult to separate foreign policy from domestic politics. The third panel will look at economics, specifically economics in terms of the vulnerability of the Armenian economy. But first, beginning with foreign policy. For too long, Armenian foreign policy has been basing its strength and success on the mistakes of others. In other words, Armenian foreign policy is generally in a strong position because of Azerbaijan and Turkey's mistakes, which is fine, but it's not enough. Armenian foreign policy needs to be much more innovative, much more creative. In other words, the policy formulation, the process is as important as the product. In other words, it's rather disgraceful that the Armenian National Security Council does not meet, does not really participate in the formulation of national security policy. It's also not enough to simply react in terms of foreign policy. We need to create more of a dynamic, proactive arena and not simply leveraging the influence of the diaspora, not simply basing foreign policy on the Armenian genocide recognition or Nagorno-Karabakh. It needs to be much more creative and innovative. The larger problem in assessing Armenian foreign policy is, for a country with limited resources, we don't leverage or harness the resources we have enough. And in many ways, the foreign policy formulation is something that needs to be deepened and expanded beyond simply a lack of press conferences, a lack of information, but also engaging in public diplomacy, utilizing the diaspora, yes, but going to the Armenian population to better explain, clarify, articulate what is Armenia's foreign policy. It should no longer be simply reactionary. Foreign policy is something that is based on national interest. And my second point is, foreign policy is also inherently challenged by the erosion of sovereignty. We have been for too long mortgaging national security and giving away slowly to the weakening of independence and sovereignty. For example, 2 of Armenia's 4 borders are closed. This is a reality and a challenge. But Armenia does not control 2 of its 4 external borders. Russian border guards do. In other words, it's not the Armenian-Russian relationship that's the problem. Russia is important and always will be. It's the terms of the relationship that presents a challenge. The asymmetry, the arrogance with which Moscow often takes Armenia for granted. What we also see is Armenia has been far too meek, timid, unwilling to stand up for itself, to defend its own sovereignty and independence. In many ways, it's the Russian military base that stands as an insult to sovereignty and independence. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, the Russians pay $74 million a year in rent, leasing the base in Kyrgyzstan. The Armenian government has chosen to finance not only the cost of the base, but to forego any even symbolic payment from the Russians. In other words, we are approaching a tipping point where it's becoming almost too late to reacquire and reassert independence and sovereignty. Against that backdrop, if we look at Nagorno-Karabakh, let's be honest, Armenia has no partner for peace. Armenia remains uniquely isolated in continuing to be committed to the hope of diplomacy, when Azerbaijan has clearly demonstrated a disdain for diplomacy, instead relying on aggression, bluff, bluster, and threats. The problem as well is perhaps Armenian foreign policy over Nagorno-Karabakh should react, should modify or change in response to the new, clear and present danger posed by Azerbaijan. For one example, the next time the Minsk group seeks to visit Armenia, we should perhaps say no and temporarily suspend Armenia's engagement in the peace process until Azerbaijan fulfills its earlier promises and its earlier pledges after April. In other words, we sometimes lack our own self-confidence in Armenian foreign policy. But again, it's the process that matters. Foreign policy decisions should not be limited to the president's office, but need to be institutionalized. Fortunately, there is optimism as we are transforming into a parliamentary form of government. Whether we like it or not, the parliament will be challenged to live up to its own potential of oversight, influence, and policy formulation. The parliament as we see it today is not yet ready, hence the need for a new, constructive, and larger opposition in the next parliament in April. But on Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia-Turkey, to be honest, these are the two issues where we support the Armenian government, and we support President Sargsyan. Support in terms of the threat from Azerbaijan and the imperative of national security. But national security is too often used as an excuse to avoid discussing and determining shortcomings in democracy and political deficiencies. In other words, national security should no longer be the accepted excuse to tolerate oligarchs and the lack of democracy. The missing ingredient in Armenia's national security and foreign policy is the lack of pluralistic democracy and economic development. These are important for national power and national security. Regarding Armenia-Turkey, specifically, we support the Armenian government's policy of no preconditions, but in many ways, the burden remains on Turkey, not Armenia. Having said that, Turkey needs to better understand that Armenian patience is not without limit and not infinite. And in many ways, the opening of the border, the establishment of diplomatic relations, as positive as it would be for everyone, is a step that Turkey has to demonstrate. The burden of proof, the lack of trust, the unreliability of Turkey is clear. And it's not an Armenian perspective, it's an international perspective. Having said that, going forward, Bright Armenia as a party and the new opposition coalition needs to do a better job, to be honest, at clarifying its own policy positions, whether in defense of current policy or in opposition. In many ways, a constructive opposition engages in public policy, but fulfills the key role that's been missing: accountability. Accountability in all areas, including foreign policy and national security. But in terms of Nagorno-Karabakh, there was an interesting and important result from the April fighting. The April clashes, the combat militarily, was the most serious since the ceasefire. And to be honest, it represents a danger because it was for the first time that the Azerbaijani military was successful in seizing and securing territory. But at the same time, it revealed deficiencies in Armenian defense reform, a lack of adequate equipment, preparation, combat readiness. More importantly, It revealed the fact that many in Bright Armenia knew, but it revealed the fact to the Armenian public that corruption is a threat to national security. Corruption can no longer be tolerated as it once was. It has become an elevated threat to national security and defense. This also means the government's pledges and promises are no longer enough, whether it was former prime ministers or current prime minister. It's no longer enough to say the right things, but actions speak louder than words. And in many ways, the real test is whether the Armenian government can improve tax collection, can combat corruption in state procurement, can actually tackle the threat the oligarchs pose to the government itself by undermining the state in terms of authority, credibility, and not paying taxes.